Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
24 minutes at 2:11 here on SAFM 104 to 107. So we're looking at the latest developments now in Syria and asking what's being done, or what should be done to resolve the Syrian conflict. Protests against President Bashar al-Assad continue despite the violent crackdown by the government that killed about, I think it's more than 9,000 people. That's according to United Nations estimates. And recently, one of the Syrian government officials confirmed for the first time that they have chemical weapons, saying that they could be used if the country faced a foreign intervention. And of course, yesterday you heard US President Barack Obama warning President al-Assad that he will be held accountable if chemical weapons are used in Syria. So we'll talk about that. Call us on 0891 104 207. SMSs to 34701. In conversation right now with Lot Licht, who is EU Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. Good morning to you, Lot.
Yes, good morning.
How are you?
I'm good.
That's great. Now, as I mentioned, we saw yesterday President Barack Obama warning President al-Assad that he will be held accountable if chemical weapons are used in Syria. Do we know how big the arsenal of chemical and other non-conventional weapons is?
We don't know. We don't have any exact figures of the arsenal at the disposal of the army. What we do know is, of course, that it is one of the biggest armies in the region, and that it is an army that has unleashed weapons and crimes upon its own population for more than a year now. So we know it is a very abusive army. And we know, of course, full well that those who bear the brunt of abuses are the civilian population, primarily in Syria.
And we've seen lots of numbers. I mean, I think it's been, 16 months since this all started. And I saw an estimate of 18,000 people killed so far. And that's a number that's climbing. Are you surprised that it's ongoing?
Well, we are not surprised. It's surprised when we look at also developments in the diplomatic world. And of course, it is an incredibly complex situation in Syria. But what, of course, equally is disappointing is that the international community has not been able to mount enough pressure on those conducting crimes against Syrians in Syria for this to stop. And for more of those who have choices to make, to choose not to follow the path of violence and crimes.
I understand that you are strongly supporting an ICC referral at this point. What impact do you think an ICC referral would have?
Well, what we have said for a long time is that what is necessary is to raise the price for abuse, and there are various areas in which that can be done. On the ICC referral question, we have for a long time worked on advancing international targeted punitive sanctions against those individuals responsible for abuse. We have worked to curtail arms going to Syria, to the Syrian government, as well as security equipment going to a government that is abusing this equipment against its own people. But the third level of, if you want to put a price on abuse, is of course to send a credible message to those who have choices to make on whether they want to commit these abuses or not, whether they want to be part of a pattern of abuse which has now become widespread and systematic, to understand that there are consequences for these abuses. And the consequence will be justice at the end of the day. And what they have to do is to look around them and see this threat in a historical context and understand that that is actually developments as we have seen them in Europe, as we have seen them in Africa, and as we have seen them elsewhere, that at the end of the day, there will be accountability. We, however, do think that such a message, of course, about the threat of accountability, and has been issued many times by the international community, and South Africa has signed up to these threats in the UN context, but they do not carry weight unless there is a real willingness also to pursue an ICC referral.
And before we talk about, why maybe, let's say, the EU, for example, should act in the face of opposition that we're seeing from Russia and China, let's talk a bit more about accountability. Would that be on both sides, on atrocities committed by both the Assad government and army and the Free Syrian Army?
Absolutely. This is the strength of the International Criminal Court, is indeed that it is an independent court, and it is impartial, and it is mandated to follow the evidence. And that means that it is a non-bias mechanism. This is very important. And of course, it's equally important now to send a very strong message to opposition fighters that they will also be accountable for serious atrocities that they may commit.
I've seen scary reports about what's happening with young children in Syria, reports coming out of those refugees who've crossed the border into Lebanon, for example. Is there a study out there at the moment? Is anyone on the ground to monitor what's happening with children?
We are many who have been looking at the situation of children and the effect that this conflict is having on children for a long time. It's also important to understand this outcry by the Syrian people really turned to a different level in response to a terrible crime against a very young boy who had been detained by Syrian security forces, and the death body was then delivered 1 month later to his family, terribly tortured, terribly mistreated. And that was really what also generated an outcry in Syria itself by the people of Syria. We have documented many crimes against children, including torture against young children in detention halls. And we will continue to seek out such evidence and put it forward when we have it. It is appalling, but it is unfortunately not unique that those who bear the major brunt of a conflict are usually the most vulnerable, and among them are, of course, children.
Well, we've heard William Hague and his French counterpart calling for a boost in EU aid to the tens of thousands of people who are fleeing Syria. Firstly, what you make of that, and secondly, the other humanitarian assistance that is being provided. By whom is it being provided, and where?
There are being humanitarian assistance provided through both individual governments, but also through, the European Union's humanitarian agency, ECHO. It's being provided to those organizations working on the border to receive fleeing refugees. It's both refugees from Syria, so Syrians, but it's also refugees from, for instance, Iraq that had originally fled into Syria, fleeing violence in Iraq, and these are now Shia refugees who are afraid to stay in Syria and are fleeing back to Iraq. That is how bad the situation has become. Equally, of course, and this is far more difficult, there are thousands of internally displaced people inside Syria that are very difficult to reach through humanitarian means.
And in addition, what do you think the European Union should do?
Well, we do believe that the European Union should now come together as a club of 27 and collectively promote and support a referral to the International Criminal Court. It is correct to say that justice is not a panacea to the problems in Syria, but justice is important. It sends important messages, and it is the one non-biased mechanism that can be invoked now. Of course, we are fully aware of the fact that there have been 3 double vetoes in the Security Council since February by China and Russia. And we are also aware that such an effort would have to be pursued through the Security Council through a Chapter 7 resolution, so that it wouldn't be easy. But it is indeed the one thing that could be pursued through the Security Council, which is of profound non-biased nature, which sends a strong message to all parties to this conflict, and has the potential to accelerate at least defections, but also to protect, in that sense, a civilian population in the absence of doing anything else that facilitates real and on-the-ground protection for civilians. And of course, if the EU could come together as 27, then they can credibly also promote and talk to partners around the world, like-minded countries, like South Africa, that have signed up and have ratified the International Criminal Court. And if there's a truly global coalition behind such an effort, then it will be more difficult for both China and for Russia to veto it in Security Council.
And what do you make of Russia's role in this? Because, as you say, they've repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions, and some are now saying that the responsibility for limiting the fallout from the disintegration in Syria will now lie with the Kremlin.
Well, many have said that the responsibility lies with the Kremlin. Responsibility with the Kremlin also lies in facilitated here and now protection for civilians. And of course, by refusing sending strong messages to all parties to this conflict, that has not been possible. Russia has definitely not lived up to its responsibility as being a permanent member of the Security Council. Maybe Russia has gotten too much attention through its stonewalling of, you could say, peaceful means, peaceful efforts, such as, for instance, introducing targeted punitive sanctions. What Russia has continued to do is to deliver arms to the government that has been documented as perpetrating both war crimes and crimes against humanity, not just by Human Rights Watch, but by UN independent bodies, including the Commission of Inquiry.
In conversation with Lotte Licht, who is EU Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. We're going to take calls as well on 0891 104 207. SMS is 34701.
Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
11 minutes at 2:11. Let's take some calls then. Let's hear from Rashad in Cape Town. Hi, Rashad.
Hi, Siki. First of all, I just must say, I'm trying very hard to restrain myself from becoming emotional with regards to the guest you have in your studio. Quite clearly, she's biased. It doesn't make any difference in terms of who she represents. She's from the West. She's a European. And she's talking about something that happened. The exact same thing was repeated in Libya, where the West removed a legitimate government because they didn't suit them. And this is exactly what's going to be happening in Syria. So as long as Russia and China continue to veto in the security, use a veto in the Security Council, the Syrian government will remain in place. The legitimate government in Syria will remain in place. Not a so-called free Syrian army, which is obviously sponsored by the West. If you look at the geopolitical terms, Syria has always been on the other side of the fence as far as the West is concerned. And this the West sees now as a unique opportunity to remove the Assad regime and replace him with a regime that will be more favorable to the Western interests. That is why Russia and China see this as a situation where they have to step in to prevent the West from continuing that process. And it's got nothing to do with civilians. Your guest is talking about the proof. What is the footprint of this organization on the ground? If a person watches CNN or any of these international broadcasts, you will see all the reporters report from outside of the country. So who is to say that anything that they're reporting on is factual? Right. You know, we must just take a step back and look at this thing. Your guest there and her organization, have they indicted any person that was complicit in the destruction of the state of Iraq, in the destruction of the state of Libya? Not once have I seen anybody being brought before the ICC for war crimes that were conducted by the European or NATO nations for bombing indiscriminately in Libya. And neither has any American soldier or the government or British officials been brought before the ICC for atrocities that were committed in Iraq.
So
I'd like to hear a response with regard to that.
On NATO, did you not see their report on Libya where they were calling for accountability from NATO?
Let's not miss the point. We're talking about the ICC. We're not talking about the NATO report that was formulated in a NATO office that exonerated them from any wrongdoing. We're talking about independent reports that prove that they bombed indiscriminately, and they are proud to admit that. I would just say that the ICC is a not independent organization until the day comes about that they indict someone from the Western Hemisphere, someone from Europe or someone from North America in one of those courts. Then the rest of the world will think about regarding it as fair and independent. But until such time, I myself, on a personal point of view, regard them as a totally biased organization.
But the point I'm making on NATO is that it did not exonerate NATO in Libya. So let's not distort what the report said.
No, well, look at the bottom line, Siki, the report was generated by a NATO organization. It wasn't an independent body. You know, so you can bet the bottom dollar that whatever they reported as erroneous, there was much more to it than that. That's the point I'm trying to make. There has to be There has to be a fair report done by an independent body.
So you're saying that?
The question I ask is: has there been anybody indicted that?
I will ask that question, but I need you to clarify this point for me. Are you saying that Human Rights Watch is firstly not an independent organization, that they are a NATO organization?
No, I'm saying that they are a biased organization. I say the report you're referring to, as far as NATO is concerned, that was generated by a NATO.
No, it was generated by Human Rights Watch.
Rashad. Watch organization.
Okay. All right, I'll get your questions answered. I do have to move on because we're running out of time, and I'll give Lotte a chance to respond. The report I'm talking about is one we reported on about a month and a half ago by Human Rights Watch, calling for accountability from NATO in what had happened in Libya. Bashir in Lenasia, good morning.
Hi, Siki, and your guest. Look, Siki, I admire your guest for her commitment to human rights, but I do despair at her naivety. You know, she made a statement that the ICC is totally independent and free and fair, and well, you know, I think to those of us who have been following, we understand that the ICC is terrified of the major powers. Nobody has been prosecuted for atrocities in Iraq or even currently in Afghanistan, where many innocents are being killed by drone attacks and so forth. So I think the Syrian president also understands quite well how the way the world works. It is not what you know or what you do; it is who you know. So it understands that if you're powerful and you're rich, you can literally get away with murder. So for her to imagine that, the president of Syria is going to be shaking in his boots simply because of the ICC, I think she's sadly mistaken. I suspect probably, things will have to take its course where the people of Syria will ultimately have to decide what to do, overthrow the government, or not, and they will have to find their own way. Depending upon international justice, I think it's simply a pipe dream.
So what do you see happening there? Because people are being killed internally.
Again, as I said, Siki, people will just have to exactly how they overthrew the Shah of Iran or in other Middle Eastern countries. The people themselves, unfortunately, will have to take matters into their own hands, and the Syrian government will have to somehow negotiate. I don't think that the international community is going to solve this problem because, as I said, the Syrian government understands it has got powerful allies, and if you have powerful allies, you can get away with murder. Okay. Simple as that.
Thanks, Bashir. That's Bashir in Lenasia. Let's hear what Lotte has to say about that. So I'll give you a chance to respond. I think let's start with Rashad, who asked us pose a number of questions. And the first one, let's maybe deal with is whether or not you called for the indictment of anyone complicit in the destruction of Libya and Iraq.
I mean, anyone who will have read our reports will know that we have done exactly that, and that Human Rights Watch, contrary actually to NATO and many other government organizations, were on the ground and investigated the crimes on the ground and not from some kind of office far away. Our researchers went and talked to victims, and we have issued a comprehensive report about serious crimes committed by NATO that we believe needs further investigation. That report is for everyone to read.
And on the question of the ICC and its independence, I think there's a lot of cynicism in the non-Western world about who the ICC targets or not, and they're saying that there's no point because it's not going to. There's no credibility there.
I understand some of the cynicism around the International Criminal Court, and my organization and myself personally, we would be the first ones to say this court is not perfect. But the enemy what we should not end up with is saying because nothing is not perfect, we should not work on getting or developing it further and work on it in real situations. With respect to being selective in terms of justice for the ICC. The ICC has not had much choice with many of the situations that it is currently preoccupied with. These are situations that have been referred to the court by governments themselves, or indeed by the Security Council. And these are situations that the ICC are then obligated to consider, and if it sees that it has a mandate, to actually undertake investigations. I just want to say that the precursor to the International Criminal Court was actually an International Criminal Tribunal established in Europe, or established by the Security Council, but for wars in Europe. And had we had an ICC at that time, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia would not have been established. Then the cases of Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, Macedonia would have been referred to the ICC by the Security Council indeed. So we already had also investigations, and rightfully so, and we had indictments of heads of government and state in Europe on the basis of those investigations. And that was absolutely vital and important also for the purpose of negotiating peace also in Europe for Bosnia and Herzegovina, that those who were considered most responsible for very serious atrocities, including genocide crimes, were marginalized when it came to negotiating the political future of that country. We would have seen today a very different Bosnia had those people responsible for the crimes, the rapes, the torture camps, the killings, had they also been sitting around the negotiating table and deciding on the future of that country, we would not have a good situation in the heart of Europe today. So justice also serves as a good vehicle to give people a chance to marginalize those who are most responsible for atrocities from not having a say in the future of their country.
Have you had any response from the EU on your call for the ICC referral?
There are already 10 EU countries that have signed up to a sort of a smaller coalition of countries in the world that are working on broadening that coalition for referral to the International Criminal Court. And we believe that we now have more Europeans on board for that coalition than we had just a few days ago. So I'm still hopeful that we will have a collective Europe, but I really also hope that countries around the world will see this as the one thing that they can do. It is the right thing to do, and it is a non-biased thing to do, and it is solemnly to help people in Syria, not to help those who commit crimes, not to stand by them, but to stand by the victims. That also sends a signal where a country is positioning itself.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's Lotte Lecht, who's EU Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch.